Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews. I am the Communications Director at inquirED, and welcome to the first webinar of our spring series, The Steps Toward Inquiry in Social Studies. If you have any questions during any part of today's webinar, just share them in the chat, and we'll make sure to try to address them at the end of the session. Also, on Monday morning, you'll receive an email from me with a link to a blog post that will include a summary of the content we've discussed, including any resources mentioned, and a video recording of the webinar. So feel free to share that out with others. The email will also include a link to request a certificate of attendance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Chat your questions as they come to you. As I mentioned, this is our first webinar in our spring series, The Steps Toward Inquiry in Social Studies. And if you notice in our graphic, you can see questions, tasks, and sources. And so we're going to focus on those essential elements, those steps toward inquiry in social studies. In this webinar, we're going to give you a broad overview. In our next webinar on March 3rd, we'll be digging into questioning, the key to unlocking the power of inquiry in social studies. We'll have on someone from the Right Question Institute. We'll have on questionologist Warren Berger, and it'll be a great discussion of the power of questions in inquiry. And then we'll be examining designing student and supporting student-led tasks in social studies. We'll also be looking at inquiry in action, classroom spotlights of inquiry work and investigation. So if you haven't signed up for those webinars, you should, and you can just go to inquirED.org and find the information there. This webinar series is brought to you by NCSS and inquirED. So NCSS, founded in 1921, the National Council for the Social Studies, is the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. It engages and supports educators in strengthening and advocating for social studies. Go to socialstudies.org to find out more. And they have a great upcoming event that I wanted to plug, another webinar, Teach Students to Argue with Reason and Empathy. It is presented in collaboration with Thinker Analytics. And it is it's going to be a really great way to analyze how to map arguments and get students really thinking about claims, reasoning, and evidence. So go to socialstudies.org, professional learning, and check that out. The series is also brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum, to move students and teachers beyond the textbook, supporting culturally responsive education and inquiry-based teaching and learning. We're so glad and so thrilled to have some of our partners here today. I just want to give a shout out to our partners across the country with special emphasis on Lake Zurich Community School District in Illinois, Talbot County Public Schools in Maryland, and Berkeley Schools in Michigan. Thanks everyone for coming today. I want to know a little bit about you. So who are you and where are you coming from, and what role do you play in the educational landscape? I'm going to launch a poll right now. What's your role? And you can choose multiple because I know many of us wear many different hats when we're in schools and districts. Are you an elementary teacher, a middle school teacher, high school teacher, instructional coach, curriculum lead, district administrator, principal? Just so you know, Zoom only gives me a limited amount of choices. So if your role is not on there, put it in the chat for us and let us know what you are, what your role is. And no matter what your role is in the educational landscape, I really hope that today's webinar speaks to you and gives you a sense of the importance of questions, tasks, and sources in taking the steps toward inquiry in social studies. I'm going to end our poll right now. About 70% of you have taken it, and I'm going to end that and then share the results. And it looks like we high school teachers are in the lead, followed by instructional coaches and middle school teachers, some elementary teachers on the webinar. Like I said, whatever your role, we really hope that you get something out of today's webinar and that you'll come back and take a look at our webinars that will follow. I am actually going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen right now because I wanted to introduce our moderator today, Shanti Ellen Govan, the CEO and founder of inquirED. Hey, Shanti. She's
Hi, Martin.
Rocking a new look. She did not lose a bet, but lots of love. Get a really good donation. So Shanti, it's great to have you here as always. And what I'm going to do right now is head into the chat, and I'll be there, everyone, to sort of moderate and pull your questions out. And then Shanti's going to give a little introduction, and then she's going to introduce our panelists. So Shanti, awesome. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Martin. And thanks, everyone. Excited to be back with us. You all, we kind of, we always have a break between our fall campaign and our launch of our new campaign. And it's nice to be back at it. So excited to see everyone here. Thanks for taking the time to join. Martin talked about the fact that this webinar series and this launch that we're launching a larger webinar series around the steps towards inquiry. And so before I bring our panelists on and before I jump into asking them questions about what that looks like, I wanted to really just kind of set the stage and talk a little bit about inquiry and just make sure we're kind of all on the same page. Martin, can you give me a shout out that you're seeing my screen?
I am not. It's just saying Shanti is screen sharing.
Interesting.
Now I am seeing your screen.
Okay, good stuff. I tried something new and I think it doesn't like that. All right, awesome. Thanks for confirming. All right, so before we get into this, I want to get into a little bit of thinking about grounding in the inquiry process. So I think what's not news to anyone here, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the inquiry process, but really at inquirED, we think of it as thinking about kind of a three-part process, that the inquiry process always begins with an inquiry question. That question really launches students into what we call a sustained investigation, where students are deep in analysis. They're really thinking about multiple sources. They're investigating information from lots of different places. And then when they move into action, they're really taking what they've learned, they're drawing conclusions and moving into informed action. They're really thinking about what have I learned throughout my sustained investigation and moving into action. And so that's kind of inquiry at a high level. But when I speak with teachers, when I speak with instructional leaders, when I speak with curriculum directors, I often hear that that is a little bit, that can be pretty overwhelming, right? So what does that actually mean? What does it look like on a day-to-day, right? So when we're talking about inquiry versus a more traditional model, what's the actual difference? What's it going to feel like, look like different in the classroom? And so what I wanted to do here with you all today is I wanted to just take an examination of looking at an example from a present day textbook. And this is also could be a digital textbook as well, but I'm going to show you something that is a picture of a printed out textbook, but it could be digital as well. And then I want to compare and contrast that and really look at an inquiry-based curriculum. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to show you an example. You're going to have an opportunity to just silently read that to yourself. And then in the chat, I'd love you to respond to these questions. And Martin, if you can do me a favor and go ahead and post these questions in the chat so we have them. What is the role of questions? What is the role of task? What is the role of sources? And what knowledge and skills can you imagine the student developing from this experience? So we're first going to do this with a traditional textbook, and we're going to have you respond to those prompts there. And then we're going to do it with an inquiry-based curriculum. I will be very upfront and say that it's an example from our curriculum. And then we'll answer those same prompts. So without further ado, let me jump into the more traditional model. So this is from a textbook. You can kind of ignore what's on the left side. I just left that there so you have the context. And what I'm just going to ask you to do is just read that right column, the Jamestown column. And so you're just going to read that, and I'll give everyone about a minute to read through that. And then go ahead and start responding in the chat whenever you feel ready. Role of questions, role of tasks, role of sources in this learning experience. Questions are asking students to recall factual information from the text. Yes. Recall questions. Yep. One right answer. Questions or recall. Yep. Sources are identified but not analyzed. Interesting. Yeah. Facts, states, filtered, secondary source. We are looking at a secondary source here. Low level question. Some seem to be any inquiry, all assessment of learning. No opportunity for individual thought. How about in terms of what students might take away? So what knowledge are they building? What skills might they be building through this learning experience? What would you imagine? The student walks away. What are they walking away with? Surface knowledge, learning to memorize, build background knowledge, but no historical thinking skills. Sources inform the reader about Jamestown and questions or to recall that information. People are going fast in the chat. I can't keep up. That's a good thing. I like it. Keep them coming. Awesome. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at an inquiry-based approach to similar content. So what I wanted to do here is kind of keep apples to apples in terms of content. So we looked at an example of Jamestown in a traditional model, and now we're going to look at an example of Jamestown in a inquiry-based model. And so I actually have a slide in here in a second after this that actually is a disclaimer, but I saw a couple of our learning experience team members in our chat. So I'm going to go ahead and say it right now because they are going to have my head if I don't say this, that what I'm about to show you is one tiny little piece of an inquiry-based module, which is a part of a larger inquiry-based unit. That in inquiry, one of the big differences is that experiences really are threaded throughout, and in going back to that inquiry process, that we don't think about things in isolation. But we're going to just kind of suspend that for a second and just look at a very specific moment in time within an inquiry, as so that we can compare kind of apples to apples of this learning experience that might be happening in a classroom one day in a lesson, and then experiencing that in an inquiry-based approach. So in this example, I'm just going to have you read the slide again. I'm going to go, this is a little different, so it's not a textbook, so I'm providing the directions here that are provided in the curriculum, a very, very, very cut down version of what's happening. This is a lesson framed by the essential question, how do cooperation and conflict affect the survival of a community? So you can go ahead and read the directions that are on the left, and then on the right, you're going to see example sources. And so this, I couldn't fit it all in, so I'm going to animate in the next one. So there's two things that the students are looking at as they look at this. So I'll give you a minute to just look at that. And then I'd love for you to go ahead and start responding to the prompts as well. Again, so what's the role of questions, the role of tasks, the role of sources, and then what do we feel that students will be walking away with at the end of this? Questions would help guide students to what they need to get from the documents. The prompt gives students a focus for their investigation work, uncovering information rather than covering. The role of questions to ask students to take a point of view to a question with no clear right answer. Questions require the need to dig deeper to investigate. It is a question that could apply to various communities. Inquiry question gives them a focus. Role of question, deeper thinking, more about the process rather than the progress. Providing for scaffolding information. Awesome. Anything about students? I think I saw a few. Students learn to contextualize and use historical perspectives. Students leave with an understanding of concepts, cooperation and conflict in a community, and a deeper understanding of the content while they are also exercise skills. Awesome, keep them coming. Thank you for that. So I will again give that disclaimer that that particular example is we're looking at a part of a lesson within a module that really students would go deeper. And so when we looked at that idea of after going through additional source examinations, that would mean that through multiple lessons, they're really diving deeper and deeper into this content. And then they would be responding to this claim prompt of was Jamestown a story of cooperation, conflict, or both? But so I just needed to give that disclaimer to make sure that to say like, It's hard to boil inquiry down to a slide, but I wanted to give that opportunity to look at both. And so I think what you all really hit on is this idea that in inquiry, there's a kind of a different approach to how we think about questions, tasks, and sources. And I often think about how we think about it in a textbook model as almost kind of a Lord of the Rings approach to it. And my older son right now just read The Hobbit. So there's a lot of Lord of the Rings talk in my household. So I'm going to use that analogy. But it's this kind of Lord of the Rings, the ring to rule them all kind of thing. And so the idea that the question, the task, and the source are all actually one thing. One publisher, one person, one thing that's all being written there, and they are all meant to go exactly perfectly together. And in inquiry, we think about these components very differently. We think about them actually as separate things that we're threading together, that we as the curriculum designers, that as the facilitator in the classroom, as the teacher, we're really thinking about how these things can come together. But that source could be different. So we could have the same question, and somebody mentioned this in the chat. We could have the same question, and it might apply to different tasks and to different sources. And that we're almost, as educators and curriculum designers, thinking about taking a different jar off the shelf that aligns and then putting different sources in and using those things as tools to really facilitate the opportunity for students to go deep into content. And then when we separate that, that's when we have the opportunity for students to really draw their own conclusions, for students to do the investigation. But when we give them this source that perfectly aligns to the question that we're going to ask them, that's not allowing them to go deep and into a sustained investigation. It's all decided for them. It's a one-size-fits-all model. Here's the thing I'm going to have you read. That's the task. I'm going to have you read it. I'm going to have you then respond to this question. And exactly what you read is the one answer that you can have here. So that's what I really think of when I think about kind of the day-to-day difference for how a student might experience inquiry in the classroom, and so much more. But if I'm bringing it down to questions, tasks, and source, that's where I would love to see it. And thank you all for being so engaged in that experience. I was curious how it would go, and so I really appreciate you all jumping in with me. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on our amazing panelists so you can hear me see me talk a little less. Natacha Scott is the Director of Educator Engagement at iCivics. Hi, Natacha. Thank you for joining us. Before joining iCivics, she worked with Boston Public Schools 14 years before beginning her journey as a third grade teacher, then curriculum writer and instructional coach, and finally as K-12 Director of History and Social Studies. She served as a steering committee member and educator workshop lead for the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap project. She is also a part-time lecturer at Northeastern University, facilitating a course on history and social studies pedagogy. Thank you, Natacha, for joining us. Dr. Scott M. Waring is a professor and the program coordinator for the Social Science Education Program at the University of Central Florida. He is the current chair for the Teacher Education and Professional Development Committee of the National Council for the Social Studies, NCSS. Dr. Waring serves as the editor for Social Studies and the Young Learner, editor for Teaching with Primary Sources Journal, editor for Trends and Issues in Social Studies, and the interdisciplinary feature editor for Social Studies Research and Practice. He has published 3 books, including Integrating Primary and Secondary Sources into Teaching, The Sources Framework for Authentic Investigation, and over 45 journal articles and book chapters focusing on the teaching and learning of history, teaching with primary sources, and the utilization of technology in teaching. Thanks for joining us, Scott, and being here today. Awesome. And finally, I'm excited to bring on Sarah Milo Hoskow. Sarah Milo Hoskow is the Director of Partner Experience at inquirED, where she leads a team of educators and professional learning specialists as they support the implementation of inquiry journeys. It does not say this, but in Sarah's previous role, she was foundational to developing our model of inquiry in how we define it. So everything that I just talked about didn't really come from my brain, it came from her brain and a lot of other folks on our team. And so it doesn't say that there, but it should say it there. And then before joining inquirED, Sarah served as a lead teacher in early childhood and upper elementary classrooms in Washington State, California, Illinois, and in Santiago, Chile. Sarah also mentored pre-service teachers both in her own classroom as well as through work with Northwestern University. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us, and thank you all. So I am going to stop screen sharing. If I can find my Zoom bar. My Zoom bar seems to have disappeared. Let's see. Where did you go, Zoom? Sorry about that. That's really weird. Like literally my Zoom bar is gone. Can you force it to not screen share anymore, Martin? Sorry,
I made you really big, so that's all I can do.
Okay. I will try to figure it out after I ask this first question. So thank you all for joining us. It's as if it's my first webinar. I guess I take a couple months off. It's a total technical mess. So sorry about that all. Thank you all for joining. There it is. It's back. Thank you. My screen share is gone. Awesome. All right. So I'd love to just hear from you all how you think about questions, tasks, and sources. And so I kind of talked to you a little bit about how I think about it in my head, but I'd love to hear from you all and just kind of really thinking about why is it so foundational to inquiry? What makes questions, tasks, and sources so important in inquiry? And I'd love to kick this question to Natacha first today.
Sure. Thank you, Shanti. It's funny because when we start thinking about the different pieces of questions, tasks, and sources, I get really excited because the opportunity to have so many different perspectives incorporated into that, right? So when we think about those sources, I think that's instantly where I dive into, because on one hand, those of you who have heard me talk before, I'm a geography nerd. I love maps. So thinking about how we're pairing some maps, how we're pairing some diary passages, how we're then pairing some drawings and images. And the students unpacking that and the tasks that you're having them do there with the different types of sources can provide so much depth to their learning. I think that's one of the things that I really love when I think about inquiry is the possibility feels like it's endless, which can be a little daunting, as you mentioned before. It can be a little daunting, but it's also really exciting as you start to explore.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody want to jump in, Scott or Sarah?
I can jump in. Or Sarah, you ready? Sorry. All right, so I think that they're all vital. And as I've seen in the chat, I'm not sure what I can tell you today that you don't already know, because we obviously have some knowledgeable participants today. So appreciate you being here. And I appreciate you. I love teachers. So this is a joy to be with you here today. Yeah, as many of you, I did not really engage in any of these in an authentic manner in my own K through 12 schooling. Really, it wasn't until I started teaching. And so I started seeing how vital inquiry was, and I started seeing colleagues in other content areas. I got more and more frustrated, especially when I was in my internships getting prepared to become a teacher. So I was a teacher candidate. And I started seeing in science, math, English language arts, and other content areas, they were actually conducting authentic inquiry in manners in which those in the discipline actually do it. And so I was thinking, why is it in the social studies classroom we're so inauthentic? So I think all these things are vital to it. And like Natacha said, I'm a primary source nerd, so I love them. So I go to that first in my head. But at least for me, I do approach it a little differently than some other educators would. I found in my own experience of teaching and working with a lot of teachers is that a large set of sources can overwhelm. And so I think there is a process to integrating all of this into teaching, making it authentic. And then I do have a framework called the Sources Framework for Teaching with Primary and Secondary Sources that I utilize. And in that framework, I really do start with one essential, what is absolutely necessary to start with primary source, and then you integrate the questions and the tasks, and then you build from there with other sources as you create an authentic narrative. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I think.
Yeah, I think Scott's an important point. That's why I kept giving the disclaimer that I'm shoving a lot onto the slide, but there's a lot more magic that needs to occur in the facilitation of that. So I think we all agree with that point. Sarah, you want to join us?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Scott just said and the overwhelm of sources. And I also saw a question very early in the Q&A around, well, what if my kids don't know how to ask an inquiry question yet? And I think in all of this, there is the role of the teacher or the curriculum design to provide structure and guidance as our students are developing these skills. And so we can design open-ended, compelling questions through that will structure an inquiry and help provide a just right amount of sources that aren't going to overwhelm. And I also love to the point around source overwhelm. the ability to come back to sources, to corroborate sources, to revisit sources. And so you're layering information over that sustained inquiry and looking for, where do our sources connect? Where do they conflict? So it's a process, it's structure. It's not just putting a bunch of books and maps on a table for students. And so those are some of the things that you both made me think about as I listened to your responses.
Yeah. Sarah, I'd love to dig a little deeper here, and we'll give this to our other panelists today, is really thinking about this idea of student voice and choice and inquiry and kind of the tension that has with structure. So, you know, I presented that slide, and it kind of has one of the challenges with the way I presented that image of components of inquiry is it's that idea that I, as a facilitator, the curriculum designer, of deciding all these things. Here's the question, here's the task, here's the source. And so I'm just curious if you can, if all of you can kind of respond to this idea, and Scott, maybe you could go first this time, just thinking about this tension and how we help teachers ride this tension of providing that structure for students, but also because student voice and choice is so core to what we think about when we think about inquiry, what that looks like.
Yeah, and that's difficult to find the balance. I think that's the thing we're all struggling with all the time, no matter what age level we teach. When you started saying that, I started thinking kind of the way I utilize the thinking in my own methods classes a lot of times is that I have some construction background and with family members in construction. And I always think about in the real world when we're building something, whether it be a house or a high rise, that we scaffold it properly. And we don't just start laying bricks and go crazy. You have to have proper scaffolding in place. And so thinking about this and what we're talking about today made me think about that analogy, is that, you know, I think as we are instructing them and making them, you know, think more critically and become independent and bringing their own questions in, that's where a lot of the scaffolding is vital. I do love, and whichever primary source analysis sheet you like to utilize, I love the use of analysis sheets and then pulling them away as students become more independent, just as something we're building, you know, as I said, maybe you're building a house, as it becomes more structurally sound, you pull away the scaffolding and then it can stand independently. So I think of, you know, our students in that way a little bit too, is that, you know, as we're building them up and they become strong and amazing and independent, then your scaffolds aren't there. And then that kind of the role obviously is a shift. And so then students are able to ask their own authentic questions and engage. As I said, and we have all been saying, and Shante, you said that there's all these steps in getting there. So I think each step in being able to remove some of that scaffolding is extremely important in this process.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Natasha, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that gradual release of responsibility is enormous when we think about inquiry. I think that's what's really daunting in the beginning. When I talk to teachers, when you're doing it yourself, like, we instantly have to go into this, give the kids 10 sources and have them analyze everything. But in reality, what are the foundational steps that you can help them understand? Because giving them a photograph, they're going to say, hey, it's a nice picture. Okay, let's look at the details. Let's zoom in. I remember being in the classroom having like the magic paper, this white paper, when you had the projector going, you'd zoom in on an area. It was the most amazing thing for my third graders. They loved it. But that showed them how to focus into a specific area and then ask questions. And those questions, you'll notice that even in that guided inquiry or that more structured inquiry, you'll see those questions start to bubble up. And I think creating the space for students to bring those questions to the surface is where you start to see some of that student agency, because then, you know, the next day when you look at that image again or that map again, hey, you have a new question, you can look at it. And I really think of that as well too. It makes me think of close reading practices when we think about literacy, right? You're going back to the same text 1, 2, 3 times and doing that same skill practice with our primary sources too. Kids are going to ask the questions and you can kick them off and get them started, but they're going to dive in and then they're going to start wondering and thinking about. And I also think about, like, what are the structures that you can put into place to capture those so they don't get lost? You know, I think about primary sources, sticky notes everywhere. Like that's good learning for me, right? That means they're like really engaged. Like, oh, what are the questions that you're bringing?
Yeah. Sarah?
So when I think about student voice and choice, a couple of things, I had original thoughts, but now I want to build on what I heard here. One is around that open-ended inquiry question that is guiding our entire inquiry. I think that having an authentic, compelling question that is not tied only to a moment in history, but is relevant to students' lives. I think that is super important, because then they are, as they are learning, what they can apply their student voice and choice to is, what do I do with this learning that has meaning in my life or my community or our world today? And so making sure that the inquiry is structured around an authentic question to students. And that's where you see the ability to bring in students' lived experiences. Their takeaways can be applied to the action they take, all of that. But I also wanted to build on Natacha's comment around questioning and revisiting questions. I really think that, and this goes to the scaffolding and building student skills. I think about we have guiding questions, but we also want our students to question, and being open to the questions they ask without judgment. And over the course of an investigation, seeing them revise their questions, answer their questions, say, actually I have a new question, and looping that in and seeing that as a really important part of their voice in the inquiry, and not having judgment around, well, I want it all to be open-ended questions. I think if we're asking students to investigate really important, authentic questions, there are a lot of right there information that they're going to have to answer. It's not all open-ended or all closed, but letting them judge, what do I need to know to respond to this inquiry question?
Yeah, I'll put a plug in that Sarah Westbrook from the question formulation technique is joining us on that. Martin mentioned earlier, but I would definitely go to that, because we use it in our curriculum. I think there isn't a better way that I can think of to get students really generating questions around that inquiry. It's a really great tool. I want to kind of, transition a little bit to some of the tensions in inquiry. Actually, we've talked about what's awesome about inquiry. I think we're all fans, right? We've got super fans here. I'm sure we've got a lot of super fans in the chat, but let's talk about some of the tensions. So I'm a curriculum, instructional coach, and I'm looking at this, and I just looked at that example that I just gave you. And in my, presentation, I acted like this is an apples to apples situation. Well, let's be honest. It took my students about maybe 5 minutes to read that text about Jamestown. And the module on Jamestown that I was mentioning is a multi-lesson, I don't know how many, I think it's 3 or 4 lessons that they would go through before they're responding to that claim prompt. So there, especially at the elementary level, where we don't see high levels of instructional time for social studies, we don't see it every day. We have teachers who probably haven't, their main area wasn't trained in elementary social studies instruction. So I'd love for you to just speak a little bit to the instructional time conundrum that we're in the elementary space, especially, but just generally, honestly, of the difference of a traditional model. I can get through a lot more versus the inquiry-based model. And I'm going to kick this one to Sarah first, because I know that she's often grappling with this with our partners in terms of instructional time. We're really going to put her on the spot.
Well, I guess I would say you get through a lot more of what? A lot of content, that great if that's what's showing up on your state test, but what if your state test changes? And so, or what, is that even your ultimate goal for your students? But even if it is, you haven't prepared them for anything other than responding to the question you hope they get asked. And so I think what I would say is, when you give students time to truly go through an inquiry process and investigate, that they're getting the skills that you could swap out that state test question with something else and they'd have the tools to answer it. They'll know how to read a map. They'll know how to identify, is this a primary or secondary source? They'll know how to compare, identify a maker's perspective and think of how that is affecting a source. And they'll be able to do that in the real world in their own lives. And so I think, you slow down, but you give them so much more. Students have the ability to build up their skills, and they're more prepared for the curveballs, whether you're worried about, state standards and tests or real life application.
Yeah. Thanks.
But I don't know if I gave you the strategy. I often also have to talk about strategies around that, but I'll stop talking for a minute. We can come back to that.
Scott, any thoughts on that?
I had too many thoughts. That's the problem. Yeah, and so yes, so many of us have seen the marginalization of social studies, and there's so many different ways. But I've got so many things running through my head. But one of the things that I love doing, and it's always one of my favorites. So I guess if we want to think of a quick strategy, I'm one who likes to utilize any moment, any second that I have. And there's often I found that there were 5 to 10 minutes, maybe at most, but usually around 5 minutes, where you just had an extra couple minutes. You're like, what do you do? I love a hide and seek game, because if you got a couple minutes, throw up a photograph and play a game of hide and seek. You have boundaries, you play hide and seek. Basically, what you try to do is find the individuals. And so then they can start talking about what they see, what they smell, what they hear within an image. So usually I do something like a street scene from a different culture or area on the map. And so we get into this hide and seek game. So I was thinking about a lot of different ways that you can find a couple minutes. You pull in some inquiry, primary source use. And I got to quickly say it was Cheryl Mason Bullock, my advisor, who I saw that actually in action many years ago, that I was just like, wow, this is so cool. But there are so many ways we can take an advantage of a couple minutes here or there with children's literature, doing book backdrops, things like that. So I think especially for a lot of our elementary crew that joined us today, that I think you probably already know how to integrate. You probably have seen a lot of ways. And so I love being able to find those little hidden spaces, but something where, having that folder with all these images. And if you have 3 or 4 minutes, throw up an image on the screen and play a game of hide and seek. And then you can use that magic paper too, when you try to find your individuals in the image.
Natasha, thanks, Scott.
I love that, Scott. I think I was definitely got into my head in terms of, we can't, especially in the elementary classroom, but you can't waste a single moment. And for me, it was always, think about what's happening during those transition times too. That walk back up to the classroom, coming in from lunch, trying to get settled down. Hey, put a question on the board, put an image on the board, put a quote on the board. And whenever you have those transition times, the students like to try to, kind of read your mind, right? Think like, oh, there's a trick behind this. What is the secret? It's like, no, it's really whatever you're thinking, whatever you're understanding, whatever questions come to mind. And I think those kind of moments, I think sometimes we think of inquiry always having to be these long, drawn out processes, and thinking about like, what is the speed version of that? I know someone in the chat mentioned sticky notes. Who doesn't love sticky notes? Same thing with whiteboard markers. Walk by, see an image. What's one thing you notice? Circle something that you notice. Make a bigger version of it. What's a question that you're wondering? Even getting students starting to generate that. I used to love having an anchor chart in the classroom, and on your way off the rug, jot a question. Okay. And as Scott referenced too, even in other content areas, as you're doing literacy, as you're reading, they can be practicing the skills of analysis in any image. And then they're taking that same skill. So if you're doing a read aloud and you have a photo image on your read aloud page, ask them the same questions to get them to look deeper and to get them to ask those questions and generate understanding, because they're going to take those skills and those strategies to the photographs you bring later, to the maps that you bring later, and starting to build those connections, then it just becomes part of second nature, right? It's not like, oh, we have to stop and do inquiry. We're just making it part of our practice, part of our life in our classroom.
Yeah. I want to push a little bit here and say, I think what you all are doing, and Scott, Natasha, what you specifically said is really supporting educators and thinking about, how do I get this in if my school building, if my district isn't prioritizing? But I want to say that I believe very strongly, and I think I agree, I'm sure that you all agree with me, that social studies deserves real estate on the schedule, that it can't just be in these moments, that we want teachers to be doing these things, but we believe very strongly, not just for the sake of social studies, if everything in the world isn't telling us that social studies matter, that for ELA as well, for other subject areas, so for everything that we want students to do, building 21st century skills, all media literacy, all the things that we know are very important for students to be developing. And so somebody said in the chat, like, how do I go have that discussion with my school, with my district, to really support this idea that it deserves real estate, that it's not just something that can be done in the 15-minute transition period before I'm waiting to go to, physical education. Scott, I don't think you've had a chance to go first. You want to go first?
Sure, you gave me the hardest question for me to try to answer. Thanks. I think there's many ways you can do it. Obviously, when I think immediately, I think of some of the amazing educators that I've worked with. So I think maybe pulling in colleagues and creating kind of your own little cohort to address this issue, whether it be at the school or the district or the state level. I would also encourage you, if you're near a university, there's university professors like myself out there who would love to work with you and chat about this, and feel free to email me. But I think that's one of the things where you can find, there's definitely some truth to strength in numbers. So I would say find the others who are passionate within your building, within your district. And then, as I said, a lot of times I feel like there is some disconnect between the university and the schools. So please don't feel you can't, don't hesitate to contact one of your university partners or one of the universities in your area.
Thanks. Natasha?
I would say start with one block, right? Start someplace and start dedicating that time, because otherwise, if you wait for the moment that you have the 45 minutes every single day, you're going to keep pushing it off, right? Once you start with that 145-minute block and like, okay, I can squeeze in a solid 45 minutes. This is my history, civics instruction, my social studies instruction. This is what I'm doing today. You'll see that the students get more buy-in, the students get more engaged, and then they're going to start asking for it too. And they're like, great, now I have student engagement, I have deep learning, and you're going to see the questions that they develop, and you're going to see the skills that they learn in that social studies block kind of blend into everything else. And so then you're going to add another block. But I think starting to make that commitment, start someplace. Don't wait until you can have the entire week, because otherwise you're never going to make it happen. So start someplace, make that commitment to that one block. But I'll also say, make sure that one block, if you're starting with one block, hopefully you can do more. But if you're starting with one block, making sure that is the most meaningful learning that your students are doing during that time. And this is where you get that question, is pulling up the textbook the most meaningful learning that can be happening during that block, that you have the students really focusing solely on history and civics instruction or social studies instruction? Probably not.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah?
I would also say there's a lot of research around the way social studies supports literacy. And I think we often see teachers saying, well, I'll pull this like thematic tests into my literacy, but I would challenge teachers to think, how can I think about this social studies activity and identify the way it's supporting literacy, and whether that's identifying the Common Core standards, if that's what is important in your district, in that activity, that might be a way to advocate for doing that, for making that space. Because I also know teachers are like, I have to do what I'm being told to do, but there are ways to do that and do social studies if you can kind of make the case for it. And then I also think we think all the time at inquirED how you don't change minds and then change practice. You change practice, you see results, and you change minds. And so if you can kind of make the case, if I can build on this idea of like for one block and say, this is why it's either reinforcing skills that we learned in science or connecting and supporting my literacy, and you see that engagement and you see the students learning, and you can say, not only can they read this text, but ask my kids about it in a month and they're still going to tell you about it. Then I think, and be accurate and tell you about the complexities and all of these pieces. Then I think as people start to see that, there might be buy-in. But I want to acknowledge it's very hard as a teacher to just like go off book and not do what you're expected to do. So I think you have to be thoughtful about making that case.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks all. Scott said I asked a hard one earlier. I'm going to turn it up a little more. And so, right now, social studies instruction is under attack. How it's taught, it's a very polarizing topic, despite the fact that social studies is barely taught at the elementary level, but we'll put that aside for a second. It seems to be in the news quite a bit right now. And the role of inquiry in this, I think, has come to be a hot button topic in several states. Actually, the word inquiry, C3 framework, things like that being called out as kind of related to a lot of the politicization around this. And so I'm just wondering if you all can speak a little bit to the role of inquiry in a politicized world and what this looks like. And so anybody want to volunteer to take this one first? It's a little bit of a hard one.
I can start.
Go for it, Sarah.
Well, first of all, it's really kind of tragic when a word itself becomes the problem, because that word doesn't then have its own meaning. But inquiry, as the way I interpret it and we interpret it in inquirED, means that we are not giving the kids takeaways. We are not feeding them their beliefs. We are asking open-ended questions, giving them authentic sources, and supporting them as they go through those tasks to analyze and look for evidence and draw conclusions. And so I think, I think one of the things that's polarizing in our country is this idea of, is someone going to tell my child what to believe? And I think at the core of inquiry, we're not. We're giving them the skills to formulate their own ideas around challenging topics. And so I guess we have to be comfortable with kids having their own ideas, but we are not feeding them the ideas.
Thanks, Sarah. Natasha.
Or I think I'll dive in here from the perspective of where EAD, the Educating for American Democracy framework, has been going, and really thinking about how do we get people to lean into some of these tensions that we see in history and civics instruction, social studies instruction, but really thinking about how are we creating the space for students to explore and come, as Sarah was saying, come to their own conclusions, right? Where are we posing these questions that are big, broad, lofty, and allow students to approach from the perspective that they're bringing, from the experiences that they have, and bringing that to the table, to the conversation, and to the engagement. And understanding that when we're doing inquiries, we have the opportunity to show different sources that represent different perspectives. And that's part of the conversation. And that's tough. That is not easy. But getting to a place that when you're creating, of course, to get there, I will give the caveat, to get there, we want to make sure that we're creating the classroom environment and the learning environment that allows for those conversations, because those tough conversations can't be in a space where you haven't created the space for discussion and conversation and deliberation and all of those aspects that come with inquiry. And that's hard. That's not an easy thing to do. But by creating that space, you take away the fear, you not take away completely, but you lessen the fear of, I'm telling you this is the only answer, this is the only perspective, because students are coming to their own conclusions by reading a variety of documents, exploring a variety of sources.
Thanks, Natasha. Scott.
Yeah, obviously we want to tend to conflict and controversy and an inquiry model if possible in classrooms. But one thing that made me think about, and when we were getting ready for this and thinking, I actually just got back from the Czech Republic. I spent 6 months there serving as a Fulbright scholar, and I spent a lot of time over the past 25 years. I've been going to the Czech Republic and spent a lot of time in the schools there. And you're here, so obviously you're doing an amazing job in your classrooms, but we do have to stop and think where we are. And kudos to you guys out there, because you are approaching a lot of these issues in your classrooms. I also am thankful we have the resources, the organizations who are putting content out there, the primary sources that we can teach with. Because when you are somewhere like the Czech Republic, very homogeneous population, there is zero inquiry learning there. There is a textbook. They have to answer the questions that are the correct answers, for the test. And they don't really have much opportunity, at least they don't see it there, to deal with conflict and controversy. And right now, there is a large Roma minority population there, and teachers don't know how to even begin to think about grappling with some of these tough questions. So at least I would say, in my perspective, in dealing with several different countries and working internationally, I'm always thrilled when I walk around in social studies classrooms. I mean, there's always some more we can do, and there's always other ways of thinking and going beyond where we are today. But I am impressed by our social studies teachers and what they are able to do. So for a lot of you, keep doing what you do. But, as you know, there's no other space for conflict, controversy. A lot of these, questions that students have in the real world, they're probably not getting attended to in anybody else's classroom. So please continue to do that in yours.
Yeah, I think what you're actually talking about, and I think you all hit on this, is actually, instead of feeling this feeling of inquiry might be bringing in polarization, it's actually our opportunity to have those discussions. So it isn't polarization, that it's discourse, that it's conversations, that we're having that opportunity, and that inquiry, in a lot of ways, to me, is actually the antidote to polarization. That's what it's designed for, rather than drawing those conclusions for students, allowing them to draw their own. So I so appreciate. Yeah,
can I
go
add
ahead.
one thing? And
Yeah,
I think
please.
that there's this piece around preparedness, and where I see it going well in districts is where people are slowing down and thinking about, what am I going to, it's not a reactionary thing. What unit am I going into? What is going to come up here? Teachers getting together to think through, how am I going to react? What resources are we going to point to? And district leaders, I know teachers can feel like they're on the front line. I think especially in a time where sometimes you're teaching virtually and anyone can be watching, it can be very, and it's so polarized, it can be very scary. And so district leaders really facilitating those conversations. Let's unpack the unit we're about to get into. Let's make a plan for this. Let me help you communicate home about what this unit is and what this unit isn't. I think that is really important.
Yeah, thanks. Scott or Natasha, any last words before I move over to the Q&A from the audience?
I normally wouldn't do this, and I hope you don't mind me doing this, but I had a recent event I was supposed to host, and I have 150 copies of my recent book, and I can send you a copy of my book free of charge. So may I put my email in there, and if anybody's interested in what I've been talking about and seeing my framework and going further, I can send them a free copy?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. Thank
Yeah.
you. Well, I kind of put you on the spot, like you're going to say no.
All good. All good. Please go for it. Yeah. Natasha, any last thoughts?
I think that point that Sarah was making, that collaboration, finding colleagues to do the work together, because everyone is, as teachers, we have our own perspectives. Everyone's going to bring different sources to the table, right? And then as you have the different sources, you have in those conversations, it's just going to create just better learning experiences for our students. And then you're going to feel more comfortable because you're talking with peers. You have a variety of perspectives in the planning and the design of these inquiry experiences for students. So yeah, collaborate.
Yeah, awesome. All right, I'm going to take some audience questions. So Faith asked, how would you address a claim that the inquiry process used is weighted toward one, I think she meant perspective, one perspective more than another? Kind of continuing to build on this conversation that we were just having. Anyone want to jump in on that one? I'll jump in and say, I think that sometimes we've gone too far. I think that that's actually fair to say, that we as inquiry educators have to always be asking ourselves, are we putting our bias into this question? Are we putting what our feelings are into how we're setting up the scaffolding of this inquiry? It is not easy to do, and to really say, is this an open-ended question that I'm asking, or am I really just putting in what I want students to take away from this? Am I really just designing the learning experience to say, here's the takeaway? So we actually, I think sometimes, like, that's not what inquiry is. That's not the definition of inquiry. But has it happened? I would say it happened. I would say that I was probably guilty of it in my own classroom at times. And so I think we've all got to really push ourselves to say, how do I do this? I again will put in a plug for the questions webinar that's coming up, because Tony Siebert, who is on our learning experience team, is going to be presenting on a framework that we use to really think about how we design questions to not lead with that bias, to not put those conclusions in. And the framework honestly has really turned my brain ever since I have heard from our learning experience team about how they're using it. So I'd love for others to hear about that as well. So, but anyone want to add anything to that?
I think you're absolutely right. In my line of work, I work with a lot of teacher candidates, and a lot of times we start talking about, I start with primary and secondary sources and talking about them, just defining, and they tend to say that primary sources are bias-free. And then we all kind of probably cringe with that comment, but then it starts that conversation of bias in our perspectives. And I think we all do need to be honest. We do have bias. I don't really know how we don't enter anything without having some kind of bias. And so that we always have that conversation. So I think it is that first step, if you haven't already, and I'm imagining once again with our audience we have, but maybe with your induction phase or new teachers at your school, if you could take an opportunity to help them, and then stopping to reflect on our own bias and our own perspectives as we go and create curriculum and what we use in our classrooms.
Yeah. Another question from Jay. What if you create an environment where students express a variety of diverse opinions, including some that aren't quote unquote politically correct, and then have other students feel triggered having to listen to opinions they don't like or agree with? Are other opinions okay when you don't agree with them? You want to jump on this one? Natasha or Sarah?
I think when we're in an inquiry and we're working towards answering an inquiry question, we're not looking for opinions. We're looking for findings and making an argument based on the evidence and, formulating strong reasoning around that evidence. And I think that pulls us back from unfounded opinions. So I think encouraging our students to go back to that. Now, I don't think that means you're not going to get difficult opinions in your classroom. And so I think that goes back to that idea of establishing the environment for this kind of discourse and thinking about, is what I'm saying true? Is it factually based? Is it hurtful? Having those conversations up front to set the guidelines for what are we talking about here and what's welcome in this space. And then challenging students always to say, are you responding to our inquiry, and are you basing that in your findings?
Matt asked, oh, sorry, go ahead, Natacha.
No, I was just gonna reiterate that's definitely the importance of the learning environment and how you're creating that and establishing that. I always remember that's something that you can't start. I mean, you can start at any point, but preferably in the very beginning of the year, day one, creating that classroom community and creating that learning environment so that you can get to those really tough conversations. You can't wait till the tough conversations happen and then react. So if you plan ahead and you're thoughtful about that, then you're not going to avoid all of them, but at least you're creating a space where you have the community to do that.
Yeah, it's like not waiting to the holidays to have all those fights with your family. So have it every day. Build the skills, don't let it pend up until not Thanksgiving. So Matt asked, do you believe inquiry learning works better for thematic social studies or chronological social studies? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Well, I can share kind of how we think about it. I at inquirED, I think I can say it, but there will always be an example of where we didn't do this. But I think we always want it to be thematic in the sense that students should be doing their investigation to respond to a question that is relevant to them right now. And so in that sense, it's always somewhat thematic. It's around, natural resources and how we use them, or it's around this idea of cooperation and conflict. But also, I think as you design a thematic inquiry, you have to be really careful about misconceptions. And I know in our inquiry design, there's often, you can't just jumble up a bunch of different times or you can't throw a bunch of sources from totally different time periods and expect really young kids to make sense of that. And so you do need to think about chronology and how you're painting a picture for kids to understand how history unfolded. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think it's a great opportunity too to just give another plug for the Educating for American Democracy roadmap with those 7 themes that we have there. And you see these questions that start with these giant thematic questions and gradually get into these driving questions. And you see how they gradually decrease and become more focused. And thinking about, even within those questions, there's connections across the theme. So there's so many different ways that you can go in planning, but making sure that you are really being purposeful with your planning. I think that's really what it comes down to as well.
Yeah, and Martin just shared the link in the chat for the EAD roadmap. Someone else asked, and Scott, I'll give this one to you. What do you think about letting the students search for the sources themselves instead of the teacher giving these to them?
I think it's an awesome idea, but once again, it depends on where they are in that process. If they're a novice, with dealing with primary sources, haven't had a chance to analyze them and think critically, yeah, that seems a little scary to me. So I'm not a huge advocate of sending them out initially, but I love them finding them as they continue through the process. So I guess it depends where in there. And I love that Lillian threw a little comment in there, and I thought about that several stages. Don't forget about your librarians and media specialists. So not only you can be thinking about it, go and pick the brain of somebody else like your media specialist or librarian. But with the students, I love when you get to that point. I've seen some of the most powerful thinking and inquiry and critical thinking when the students are the ones who find the sources. And one of my unique approaches, I think it's unique. Maybe everybody does this, and I just think I'm cool. But often I'll get students on eBay, not to go buy anything, but I'm always amazed at what unique primary sources are available in these high quality images, and they can read the letters. So it may be some letter that's being sold for $2,000 that nobody could ever afford, but students could actually find some pretty cool primary sources on eBay. But as with everything, you have to be careful with what they search and what they're actually going to find with their searches.
Yeah, there's that scaffolding. So, one of the things about a textbook is it's all right there. And then we give a question to students saying, go grab a laptop and go at it. But we're not giving them that opportunity to actually be in the real world of how they might find sources. So how do we scaffold to giving them sources that are actually on external sites, giving them the opportunity to understand how they might think about who the author is, who where's the maker, where's this coming from, what's the perspective, and then having them go out and not into their own. It's really like setting them into the wild, wild west is I think what you're getting at. It's really that scaffolding. We'll end with this question. What's your feeling about combining two subjects such as ELA and social studies to create a sort of consistent inquiry-based project? Natasha, you want to start us off there?
I'm just doing the math. If you take a block of ELA, a block of social studies, suddenly you have more time. More time. So I'll leave it at that. I think if you plan it right and you make those connections, you're, just as Sarah mentioned earlier in our conversation, you're taking the skills and the practices and the content knowledge that you're developing in history and social studies. You can take that into writing. You can do some amazing, I've seen some kids do some amazing poetry connected to this different content. So have fun with it, but that just equals more time.
Awesome. Well, great. Awesome. We are a minute over, so we are going to go ahead and end it here, but we keep talking all day. Thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you so much to our audience. We had such an awesome, engaged audience in the chat. Thank you for all of your great questions and thoughts and really engaging with us all today. And we will see you, I believe, in a month or so on our next webinar about questions. So I'll hope to see you there. Thank you all and have a great night.
Bye-bye.